Okay.
Good morning of Kairos of Oak Ridge. We have the pleasure this morning of having Dr. Howard Merkin and his wife Cassandra here to visit with us today, and he's going to be here for the next few weeks as he teaches this series of the Jewish background of the Bible. We met Mr. Howard through his son, Chaim, at least I did, and Chaim is a very industrious young man at the age of 15. He's got his own yard business and he's got all kinds of irons in the fire that he's doing to get himself a little income. And we've had him at the house several times and helped around the house. And then we found out about his father, who is a Jewish man, who is now a child of God through Yeshua HaMashiach. And maybe he'll give us a little bit of the background of that story, how he came to that. And he's going to teach us this series this morning. And we just welcome you, Dr. Merkin. Pleasure to have you here.
Okay, I grew up in a Jewish home, Reform. I did go to conservative Hebrew school for a few years. And I became a Christian at the age of 19 at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. You can tell by my accent, I'm from the Boston area. So ZooMass, we call it. It was, at that time, not a very good school. Large, maybe 20,000 students, but not very good. I was thinking one day, what if there's a heaven or a hell? Where am I going? So, of course, I rationalized my way to heaven. I wasn't all that bad. And the next day, I found a book called The Lake Great Planet Earth on a friend's coffee table in her room. And I started looking at it, and it was published by Bantam back then, the same publisher that was publishing Eric von Daniken's books, like Chariots of the Gods, that kind of stuff. So I thought, hey, another book against God, you know. So I started looking through, because it was the same, it's been through a few publishers, and I guess it's also been revised, from what I've heard. But I started looking through it, and it was interesting. Then came spring break, and I came back from spring break a day early, couldn't even get in my dorm, knocked on a basement window where those students lived, one of them owned the book. And so a young lady let me in. I said, can I borrow your roommate's book? It was a Saturday. Wasn't supposed to be back till Sunday. So I skimmed it again a bit, read it from about 2 to maybe 5:30 in the morning, that Sunday morning. And it's got a gospel message in it, and I got saved because it was the gospel. I realize this doesn't work with everybody, but the gospel was presented to me logically and with reason to believe, not just believe. There was reason. Now I realize some of what's in the book is wrong. Jesus Christ did not come back by 1988. And I've survived so many raptures and second advents, I've actually lost count. I used to I wrote a book, and I actually had all these years that, people write books. And I'm not mocking the second advent. I realized, Peter warns us against mocking that sort of thing. I think it was the 1st or 2nd Peter. But the fact is, I got saved. There was a logical reason, and that's what I needed. And it does talk about, much of that book is still relevant despite some mispredictions and despite a lot of speculation. Because it mentioned that, you get all these hundreds of prophecies that were fulfilled in the first advent. And of course, then he predicts what's going to happen in the years preceding the second advent. But very controversial statement I'm about to make. I made a conscious, logical, calculated, analytical decision for the gospel while in my unregenerate state, as God was opening my eyes and heart. And that I have certainly been challenged on in certain groups. Now, I've got a 13-part PowerPoint presentation on the Jewish background of the Bible. A bit about my background. I did go to Bible school, dropped out of UMass, which I couldn't stand. I mean, you got to realize what it was like in those days. Just the dorms were terrible. I mean, people coming into your room taking things without your permission because they know the RA, for instance, and he's got a key, and it was a nightmare. People blasting their music, couldn't study. Anyway, I could go on and on about that. But I dropped out and I went overseas for a year. I went over to Israel and did it's about a 5.5 month program called the Ulpan. Ulpan in Hebrews gets tricky because they usually accent the last syllable. So when you're saying something in English and you put an Hebrew word in there, you feel like saying Ulpan. It's the Ulpan. It just means, I guess gets translated as studio. But it's really an intensive Hebrew study program. And I was in a kibbutz Ulpan. this kibbutz, and I'll talk about that later, what it is. It's an agricultural collective. You could go on for a 5.5-month program, and you learn Hebrew 4 days, no, it's 6 days a week. Sunday's like any other day in Israel. They get a 48-hour work week there. And Saturday's Shabbat, Sabbath, that's your day off, unless you actually have a job you have to do on Saturday, which some people do, including me, even now. But I'm not working today. But there's, you study Hebrew 4 hours a day, like in the morning. Then you work 4 hours in the afternoon, and the next week they reverse it. They go back and forth. Now, if you have to work at the lul, the chicken coops, that's done at like midnight or 1 in the morning, so things get a little messed up then, including your sleep schedule. But that's basically how it works. So you're in there with people from all different countries, and you're learning Hebrew in Hebrew from day one, because you don't have a language in common. You're in there with Dutch people, people that are Spanish speaking, Russian, whatever. Actually, I didn't have any Russians in my first ulpan. But it's a 5.5-month program, and they take you on these things called tiulim. That's plural for tiul. Tiul is a trip. So you get on a bus maybe a few times, maybe it's a 1-day trip, then you go on an overnighter, maybe even a couple of nights. They show you the country. The ulpan was originally developed to get people, Jews come into Israel to teach them Hebrew. Now, it's more Gentiles than Jews in those programs quite often, and these days they charge you for it. It used to be a free program. They realize it's to a large extent a bunch of tourists and stuff, people who aren't going to stay, who aren't even allowed to stay more than 2 years. Because if you're Jewish, under the law of return, you can become an Israeli citizen. If you're not, you're going to have to leave after a couple of years probably, and then be gone for a couple of years, then come back as a tourist or something. But they had 3 kibbutz movements, and they had headquarters, so they send you to your kibbutz movement headquarter to listen to a seminar for 2 or 3 days in your native language. They send you off in pairs. So I remember I got sent off with a Canadian girl because she was English speaking. And then I was in Europe for 6 months, my old stomping grounds, it's a long story to that. But then I came back to the United States, and I actually went to Bible school, graduated, went back to Israel for another ulpan, because it can total a year on the kibbutz. You get Aleph Bet for your first 5.5 months, and you get your Gimel for your second. And there were programs beyond that, but I don't think they were held on the kibbutz. Then I came back again. And anyway, since then I've gone back to college at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, of all places. I guess Massachusetts wasn't cold enough for me. But, I got a bachelor's and a master's in chemistry there, and then went down to Texas Tech, where I found my love in the cafeteria. The way to a man's heart is through his stomach. And I got my PhD there. I'm also a licensed and ordained Baptist preacher, and I've also graduated Tennessee Correction Academy as a prison guard. I'm now a correctional counselor. I've switched to counseling, but I still do security shifts on my days off, which I'll probably start doing next week again. I'll try for second shift because it brings in extra money. Anyway, I have a very strong interest in, when you read the Bible, and we'll go through some of this, it was not written in King James English or any type of English. I know, it's a shock for some people. I've actually run into problems in churches, one in particular, which was a very good church, but you talk to, what's the Hebrew say? That was a heresy, basically. And I've run into issues like that. It was written in Hebrew and in Greek, and a little bit was written in Aramaic. And I believe strongly in original languages, and I believe strongly in knowing the history. The Bible is written for everybody, but it was written to very specific people who knew the events, which we don't know unless we read about them. Okay, well, look at Herod. Here's Herod. If I ever get on this pulpit committee to hire a pastor, I'm probably going to ask a question like this: who wanted Jesus dead when he was a baby? Well, it's Herod. And then what was Joseph told? What did the angel tell Joseph? They are dead that sought the young child's life. One of Jesus' trials was in front of Herod. I thought he died. Paul had to talk to Herod. How long does this guy live?
That same guy.
It's not the same guy. There were 7 Herods in the Bible. 3 of whom were actually called Herod. Okay? But the Bible doesn't have to explain this in detail because it was written to people who knew all that stuff, including that scandalous divorce and remarriage. John the Baptist spoke against it and got his head cut off. There happened to be 4 Philips in the New Testament, probably 4.
For what?
Philips, 4 people named Philip.
Mhm.
Philip the Tetrarch was not the same as the one Herodias married. That was a different Philip, same father, different mother. I have spent days just trying to learn the Herods. But we'll get into this. I come from Massachusetts. We get a royal family, the Kennedys. If you say Kennedy said, well, which Kennedy? That's nothing compared to Herod. He had got married 10 times. Had a whole bunch of kids, executed some of his wives, some of his kids. Tried to execute Jesus when he was a baby. But anyway, you got to know the history, the original audiences. There's a lot to the Roman patron-client system, which I think America is adopting now. I call it the bribe system. That's how Congress works. What do you call those guys? Lobbyists. But the old patron-client system, you understand that. You understand when Paul says, God's able to supply everything. And Paul wasn't just stating a theological fact. He was saying, I'm not your client, and you're not my patron, you people that have given me this money. You don't understand. None of this really changes any major doctrine in the Bible. But, when I was a kid, I took pictures. I love photography. So it's black and white, right? Then I switched to color. You see a lot more in color. Knowing the history, the languages, the original audiences, turns the black and white of the Bible, and of course I got red letters in my Bible, into living color. And the claim that the Holy Spirit's in you and can reveal stuff, yeah, he can illuminate stuff. And the Holy Spirit illuminates a lot more when you actually understand all this background. Because it was a different culture than we have, especially Eastern culture. Our big battles that we've thought of in the last couple of hundred years, the North and the South in the United States, North Korea versus South Korea, North Vietnam versus South Vietnam. Well, the last 2 had to do with communism. But actually, the real big cultural divide is East and West, and we're talking in Eastern culture. They see things very differently, and one of the battles in Israel now is that Israel is a very westernized country in the Middle East, with a bunch of Arabs who are very Eastern and see things very differently, and we'll get into that. So this is a 13-part PowerPoint series on the Jewish background of the Bible. Now, I guess I'll stand here and let you. Okay. Now, quick quiz. Okay, because I want to show us, I want to see what you guys know about history. How am I going to do this? Am I in your way here? No? Okay. Who said the earth was round when everyone else thought it was flat? You don't answer.
Galileo.
Galileo?
Magellan.
Magellan?
Was it in Job?
It's in Isaiah.
It's in the Old Testament.
That's true. I didn't even think of that. I'm thinking of my history
Thought you
classes in
meant the
high school.
1500s.
Huh?
I thought you meant the 1500s.
Yeah, okay, 15th century, 1400s. This is what I'm thinking of.
Okay.
You guys are enlightening me. I never thought of that.
Okay.
Joe.
He was martyred.
Who was it? It wasn't Leonardo da Vinci, was it? It was somebody back then.
Everyone will say it's Columbus. At
No.
least if you're from my
No.
generation.
See, yeah, that's.
Which is crazy. You know why?
No.
By 500 BC, the ancient Greeks, they measured the circumference of the earth. They knew what it was. What I was told in school was people thought the earth was flat and Columbus said it was round. Where did they get that? Check out Don't Know Much About Geography by Kenneth C. Davis. I wish our library had it. I used to have it. I had to get rid of 80% of my library, something like that, during a move. This is Columbus. I always read that the world, land and water, was spherical. Now I observe so much divergence that I began to hold different views about the world, and I found it was not round, but pear-shaped, round except where it is a nipple, but there it is taller, or as if one had a round ball, and on one side it should be like a woman's breast. In this nipple part is the highest and closest to heaven. Christopher Columbus in the log of his third voyage. See, when I was a kid, that's what they said. Well, Columbus said the earth is round, everyone else thought it was flat. And, if you listen to that Alan Sherman song, how Columbus fell off the edge of the earth, it's a funny song. He does comedy. But the thing is, where do we get these ideas? It took us, as I remember from this book, it took us, I think it was like 1958, we sent up with satellite, Vanguard, and the guy tracking the satellite realized the Earth's not round after all. It's not, folks. It bulges 500 miles in the southern hemisphere. It's as I remember from the book. I could copy this by getting onto Kindle and downloading just the free part, look inside. Okay, so I have to buy the book to reread all the details. Okay, who discovered America?
Vikings came to Vinland.
Well, I mean, we know the kind of
It was,
answer.
it was the Viking.
Columbus gets credit for it.
Exactly.
Columbus gets
yeah,
credit.
Yeah, Columbus
Yeah.
gets credit, but it was the Vikings of the, what's his name? I
Leif
can't-
Erikson.
Leif Erikson.
Yeah, like Americans.
Really?
Yeah.
How many? Do you think there was nobody here?
But no, but they don't credit that
Oh,
in
okay.
school,
You
though.
want to go back?
We got
further than
millions of
that?
people here. How can you discover something millions of people are sitting on top of? I'm trying to show you that our ideas of history are nuts. Certainly wasn't Columbus. When did World War II start?
1931 or 2, right along there. I mean, the official first. Well, he took over Austria and part of Czechoslovakia or something. He took that first. They caved, but the actual first attack was 39 when he attacked Poland. But it started probably at the end of World War One.
Who is he? You're using your pronoun.
Well, we're talking about Hitler.
You think that's when World War? Okay.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
he was in the army in World War One, and he wrote
Yeah.
his Mein Kampf thing, and they started it all began because of the reparations they were forced to pay, and all the inflation and all that led to them wanting to get out of all that mess. But go ahead.
Now, okay. Any ideas? Like September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. That's what you typically read in history
Well, it
books.
actually started prior to that.
Yeah.
He absorbed Austria and.
But did it start with Hitler? Why did the U.S. get involved with World War II? We didn't want to get involved. 25% of us are German ancestry, at least back then. We didn't want to fight the Germans. We were Germans ourselves. Quarter of us. We had nothing to.
December 7th, 1942.
Okay.
Pearl Harbor.
What? Oh, so the Japanese.
Yeah.
How far did their hostilities go back?
They were attacking China in the early 30s also.
Now you got
Manchuria.
it. Official start date that you keep reading in history books is September 1st, 1939. World War II started when Hitler invaded Poland. We got involved because of Pearl Harbor. We didn't want to get involved with that war. Or World War I, by the way. Japan invaded Manchuria. The Japanese were trying to shut us up. They attacked Pearl Harbor. The idea wasn't really to invade the U.S. It was we just sue for peace. They were sick of us complaining, basically, I guess is what it was. They were invading these different countries, and we were starting to say, hey, what's going on here? They invaded Manchuria in 1931, September 18, 1939. 31 is probably a start date for World War II, not 1939. Another date I've read is World War II began on July 7, 1937, not in Poland or at Pearl Harbor, but in China. Japan invaded China. There was Manchuria, then China. That's when the war started. Probably 31. We just look at what Hitler did. Excuse me, we got involved in the war because of Japan. Japan attacked us. We declared war on them. Then Germany declared war on us.
Well, we stopped supplying them with raw resources. That's what kind of was part of the trigger towards us.
Yeah. Who was our first president? We all know that, right? Or you
George
dare
Washington.
answer. George Washington, right? That's what they tell you in school. They don't know their history.
Really?
John Hanson, the first president of the Confederation Congress or president of the United States and Congress assembled. George Washington was not our first president. We had 14 presidents before Washington under the Articles of Confederation. We're so embarrassed about the Articles of Confederation. We don't even like to talk about them. Okay? Now, at that point, at that time, we did not have three branches of government. The president now is part of the executive branch. Back in then, it was really, Congress. They didn't have a separate executive branch.
Was he elected by the people as president?
I'm not sure. Okay, so now, this is about the Jewish background of the Bible. When were the Jews kicked out of Israel after the time of Christ?
135 AD was the final lick. 70 AD.
They were never completely expelled.
Okay.
There has always been a Jewish presence there, especially Jerusalem, Safed, Tiberias, and Hebron, the four holy cities of Judaism. There were also Jewish communities in Gaza, Rafah, Ashkelon, Caesarea, Jaffa, Akko, and Jericho. Now they got pretty much kicked out of Judea, and this is stuff, I have grad school in Jewish studies in mind. I really do. I've thought of this 15 years ago, 14 and a half years ago. I just haven't had the time or money to do it, but someday. But I've been studying about this, and I got to learn more about this, because actually, the Orthodox Christians pretty well destroyed the Jews from Israel at one time, but I think there were still some Jews left in there.
Yeah, there was always a few.
Always a few. Okay, when did the Jews start returning to what became the modern state of Israel?
During World War II, they were going there even before it became 1948. They were trickling in.
What's a good date? Okay, good, because some people would say 1948. How
No,
come
they
I
were-
wasn't born there?
No, they were trickling in. They were getting out of Europe because of all that was going on there, fleeing the Holocaust.
1803. They came as individuals. Now, there had already been some Jews there, but they started returning individually in 1803. 1881 was the first wave of immigration, called an aliyah.
That's because of what was going on in Russia, probably.
Yeah, stuff like that.
Pogroms. Yeah.
And an aliyah means ascension. And actually, it's got probably four meanings. You ever notice how the Bible, the Old Testament, you go up to Jerusalem, even if you're coming from the north, you're still going up to Jerusalem? It's on a hill, but you go up to the temple, songs of ascents. Okay? It's an ascension. So it could be going to the temple, could be coming to Israel, or especially Jerusalem. So that's two meanings. Third meaning is to immigrate to Israel is called making aliyah. Fourth meaning in the synagogue is if you come up to the bima, which is what they call the pulpit, that's called an aliyah. It's an honor, which has been denied me a couple of times by rabbis who said, you're not Jewish, you're not going to do it at family events. Another rabbi said I could. But how many tribes of Israel were lost during the Assyrian invasion and captivity of the north?
10.
10. You ever read the book of Luke? Luke 2, I think it's 42. Anna, the prophetess, is from what tribe?
Asher,
Well, it's one of the 10, isn't it?
one of the 10.
So, if that tribe was destroyed, how come you got someone from that in the New Testament?
Well, there's probably always a few that got left behind. The Syrians didn't take everybody, but they took the vast majority of them, right?
They still
Yeah.
had tribes memberships.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
But
Yeah.
they try to put them all into one tribe.
There are no 10 lost tribes. That's not in the Bible. They took most of the Jews living in certain tribal areas. But we'll see later, the verses, people moved. Like I moved from Massachusetts to,
Yeah.
I've lived in 10 states plus a state of mass confusion for life. But people moved. Now maybe they weren't supposed to. The law of Moses, with its inheritance laws that that you find especially in Numbers 27 and Numbers 36. Remember, you had 5 daughters of a guy named Zelophehad, and no sons left, no sons, and the father dies, and the women want an inheritance, so that their father's name isn't extinguished. And that's when God says, look, if there are no sons left to inherit, a daughter can inherit. We don't want land moving from tribe to tribe. But people still moved anyway. remember Ruth, the Moabites, remember that story? People had to leave Israel or Judah because actually Bethlehem, because of a famine. They went to Moab. And 3 guys died, and the story goes on. But people moved around, and especially if you see the Assyrians coming down on you, you're going to hightail it to Jerusalem, which has got big protective walls. There are no 10 lost tribes. There never were. The Bible doesn't even say so. And in fact, it gets into the New Testament. You see the 12 tribes. People try to rationalize that. Well, it's just symbolic of the church. No, it's not. I'm trying to show you that our ideas of history are so skewed. I mean, I got this when I was a kid anyway. Columbus discovered America. You kidding? Now, whom are the Arabs descended from?
Ishmael.
Where did you read that? Where in the Bible does it say that?
It says that there are 12 princes.
Yeah?
It doesn't say Arab. It's not spoken.
And it's not all Ishmael. It was Ammon, Moab, the children of the daughters of Lot. Also, were in that area. They're part of that.
I keep hearing church after church, or conversation after conversation. The Arabs are descended from Ishmael, the wild man in the desert. You know something? That happens to be an Islamic teaching. It's not in the Quran, but it's an Islamic teaching. We Arabs are descended from Ishmael. That's not in the Bible. That's an Islamic teaching. Never could you trace their lineage to Ishmael, at least in the Bible or any records we have. That is an Islamic teaching that we, the church, have fallen for.
Well, the word Arab, you know what the word Arab is?
Well, east. Wait a minute, not Mizrach. West.
Arab means red dirt.
Well, no, that's Edom. Edom.
Okay.
Mizrach. Okay. It's
Part of those people had to be in that area.
yeah, maybe.
Ishmaelites,
But
Barbie?
and Ammonites and Moabites.
yeah, I mean, and they're descended from other people. But this teaching that they're descended from Ishmael
Not all of them,
is an
absolutely
Islamic
not,
teaching.
no.
Yeah, some of them maybe.
What's
We know
your source there?
What's my source?
Yeah, you said it was Islamic. So what's your source? I mean, where's that?
I went online. I tried to find in the Quran. I knew that wasn't a biblical teaching, and I know the Muslims teach it. So I try to find where it is in the Quran, and I went online. It's not in the Quran. It just happens to be a teaching. It's not in there at all.
Well, can you transliterate the word, or can you change that word? That's an English spelling of an Arabic word, is it not?
Would be west. West. Mizrach is east. Safon, Tahom. Mizrach is east. From Erev, let's say evening.
Neither day or night.
I don't get that.
Okay, that's what is it like at dusk? It's the end of the day,
Yeah.
and I won't take it any deeper. It's kind of deep.
But I'm just, yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's stuff I don't know about it, but I've learned to question a whole lot of stuff because the sign of Christianity should be the cross. It's become the parrot. Okay? I went to Bible school. I learned the Bible. It was basically a Baptist school. But I learned our denominational paradigm, and that was all important. And as I've talked to people that have graduated their Bible schools and seminaries, that's what you learn. You learn to parrot the denominational paradigm. If you don't get ordained. Scandals in Christianity. We think of popes with illegitimate children. Modern evangelical leaders. It's just, I'm not casting stones. It's just been another one. Our reaction? What is our reaction? Oh, that's terrible. It's those churches. We won't do that. By the way, organization corrupts. The greatest Christian leader I've ever known in my life is named Ted McKinney. I worked for him in Alaska. He was a program director at Solid Rock Bible Camp and eventually became the head of Solid Rock Bible Camp. He is by a long shot the greatest Christian leader I've ever met. He has died. Right after retirement, stage 4 brain cancer. He died in about 6 months or so. He became executive director of Solid Rock Ministries. It's a great place. I worked there for 3 summers. Once with my wife. I know I lived in Alaska twice. It's a long story in my life. But second, I was working up there for a summer with her in the snack shop, and I did some other stuff. First 2 summers I was there was a counselor. Actually, it was summer, counselor one summer. Went to family camp as a single guy the next summer, counselor again, and family camp because of stuff I was doing on campus at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. But he actually has visited us, and he visited me with his family in Texas, because he'd leave Alaska and go with John Brown University and study. And then he visited us when we were living in Maryland. But he told me that at some meeting, he confided in me because I was his age. Most of these counselors are much younger. I was the oldest counselor. And he said he mentioned in a meeting, organization corrupts. And it's true. Organization corrupts. But what's our reaction? Well, we're not going to do that. That's terrible. Or a lot of people react, well, Christianity's a bunch of baloney. But, where was more bloodshed? The Reformation?
Talking about Martin Luther,
Yeah.
Tom Martin Luther.
Or the pogroms and the Holocaust.
Well, Martin Luther was a little bit anti-Semitic there at one point.
Very. He
stirred
wrote.
up trouble.
He was philo-Semitic at first, and when the Jews didn't convert, he became very anti-Semitic. Wrote a couple of tracts against them. He was, in a sense, the Hitler of his day, although he didn't go killing people. He just wrote stuff. The thing is, people will say, well, Christianity's terrible. I know someone that says, religion is why you get all this bloodshed. Nothing compared to communism, by the way.
Oh, no.
See, you take away religion and it gets much worse. So, the Reformation, yes, there was bloodshed. The pogroms and the Holocaust were much, much worse. How many tens of millions died as a result of that? Here are reactions I've encountered, okay? I've been all over the place denominationally, by the way. For several years, I went to different churches outside of that Baptist-type place I went to. I've been a Lutheran, a PCA Presbyterian, went to Catholic services right here in town, St. Anne. St. Mary. I've gone to St. Anne, which is an Orthodox Church of America, and I spent probably over a year at services and catechisms, especially of St. Nectarios, which is a true Russian Orthodox church in Lenore City. Now, the Orthodox Church of America here is Russian in style, although not officially. It's not part of the Russian Orthodox Church. But as long as they believe in the deity of Christ, the Trinity, for years I would go and just see everything out there, so I don't have to listen to what other people tell me about them. You're in there, and I could say a lot about that. But what's interesting is when you bring up, or they bring up, you take a new members class in a church a lot of times. Lutheran church I was at, it was LCMS, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, so they're conservative. They just mentioned Luther was a crotchety, I didn't even bring it up, Luther was a crotchety old man. And, I guess he lost a kid. Didn't he lose a couple of kids, I think, as young people? And I think they have 6 kids and 2 died or something. He lost a kid. That was their explanation for Luther, okay, for his anti-Semitism. Luther was a product of his times. I heard that from a friend arguing on Facebook. And that's a common thing you hear. They deserve to die. Now, this book I read, Jews that were executed by the Catholic Church. Now, I maybe should take that off, and here's why. This thing, it just doesn't work on that screen. That's what they warned me about. Okay, they deserve to die.
I've heard that in recent years.
Oh,
People say that. I've actually heard Christians say that.
This is a book that was given to me by a friend. I guess it was one of those old library books that they sell when they get really old. Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Conway, The Question Box. It started out, now it was a long time ago I read this, I'm trying to remember, it's something like a World's Fair or something where people would put in a box questions about the Catholic Church and they got answered, and it found its way into book form. You can still get a more modern version of this now. I mean, this guy's long gone. This was like late 1800s. He mentioned, people would ask him, the Crusades, the Inquisition, whatever, and at some point, and it might have been the Inquisition, they deserved it or something. It's been so long and I don't have the book anymore. So I got to be a little careful with that one. I can remember that. Yeah, they deserve to die. Exaggerated? Oh yeah, this was Russian Orthodox priest, and I asked him probably after a catechism class. The Khmelnytsky pogroms, 100,000 Jews killed, perhaps. It's hard to track the exact number of that would happen in the 17th century, right? 1648. 300 Jewish communities destroyed. And he thinks it's exaggerated. It's man's, but it could be. We don't know for sure how many were killed. But he just said it's man's inhumanity to man, not, whoops, we blew it. The Kishinev pogrom, 1903, there were Orthodox students raping Jewish women. But that's much more, they got pictures from back then, so that's much, more verifiable, the exact numbers killed and everything else. But people just kind of blow it up. That's the thing that gets me. People don't face what their theological ancestors have done. And we will face that here. The real scandal is not only how Christians have treated the Jews, which, by the way, for the last 2,000 years has usually been pretty poorly. And I'll show you that it's not just those unsaved people out there. That's the problem. We think, well, they're not real Christians. The church has ignored Jewish history. Now, who is a Jew? Is it somebody circumcised? Abraham, Genesis 17 is where circumcision is first introduced. Not necessarily first practiced, but introduced. At Abraham, this is what you're going to have to do. Passover in Exodus 12. Remember, they had to be circumcised to keep the Passover. Joshua 5:7. And their children, whom he had raised up in their stead, this is after they crossed into the promised land, they're going to have their first Passover. Then Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not circumcised them by the way. Okay, for 40 years they hadn't been circumcised. So it's all these definitions for what a Jew is, and it's still, that you'll find. It could be somebody circumcised. Who is a Jew? Is a member of a race? Is it a race, which makes it an ethnicity, really? Parents, are your parents Jewish? Biblically, if your father was Jewish, you were Jewish. Modern Judaism sees it as your mother, probably because you always know who the mother is. You don't always know who the father is. It's probably the reason they do that. Is it a member of a race? Well, it's certainly not a pure race. Okay? And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man child in your generations, he that is born in the house or bought with money of any stranger. So it's not just a physical descendant of Abraham, which is not of thy seed. He that is born in thy house and he that is bought with thy money must needs be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. When circumcision is instituted, Abraham, your descendants have got to be circumcised, but there's also going to be people that, back in those days you bought servants and stuff like that. They need to be circumcised to be part of this covenant. It's Exodus 12:38. When they left Egypt, it was a mixed multitude. There were other people that joined up with them.
Mm-hmm.
Tamar in Genesis 38, the one who had that incestuous relationship. And it's interesting, Matthew, the Jewish gospel, leaves out 4 kings. When he says there were 14 from Abraham to David, all that. When he lists the kings, he leaves 4 of them out. He does things that are very distinctly Jewish that we don't always like, and there are a few things he does. But he leaves out he mentions these 4 women. He leaves out 4 kings and he puts in 4 women. Well, Tamar certainly wasn't Jewish. Genesis 38, we read about that scandal. Matthew 1:3, we see her listed. Matthew 1:5, we see Rahab listed. Well, she was a Gentile. By the way, she didn't do anything wrong by lying. I get a kick This is why, okay, there is a view that maybe every young American should be in the military for a couple of years. I'm not saying I agree with that view. But we are, at this point, we don't understand warfare. Let's put it that way. When you're in warfare, and this is when people lie in the Bible, and the Bible never says they did anything wrong. Okay? Including Yael, who put a tent peg through Sisera's head as he came to her for protection and for hiding. The Bible has plenty to say against lying. But in warfare, they capture me and we're regrouping to the north. I'm going to say they were regrouping to the south. And that's not a lie. Biblically, it's not a lie. Ruth the Moabitess, she wasn't Jewish. Bathsheba, we don't know. You don't know. She married a Gentile. Then again, it's a Hebrew name, so we're not, well, Uriah is too. Even as language developed then, who knows what. But it's still trying to figure out where Hebrew even came from. She might have been Jewish. There's lots of intermarriage. Judges 3:6, and they took their daughters to be their wives and gave their daughters to their sons and served their gods. Judges 12:9, and he, Ephraim of Bethlehem, had 30 sons and 30 daughters whom he sent abroad, and took in 30 daughters from abroad for his sons. And he judged Israel 7 years. But what races are pure? This is something a rabbi mentioned. I had these MP3 downloads by this rabbi who might have exaggerated certain things, but he said the Italians of today are not the Romans of 2,000 years ago. He said this, the Greeks, the Egyptians are not the same as they were. Okay, there's been, people come in, invade, all kinds of stuff. Judges 3:7, and the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and forgat the Lord their God and served Baalim and the groves. What is the religion of those who forgot God? They were still called, by the way, in these groves, we'll get into that. They were still called the children of Israel, and God still had a covenant with them. Now, religion. If a Jewish religion, well, there are 3 main religious groups today, and we'll get into the details more. Because they used to just be Orthodox, but they weren't called Orthodox. Because he didn't need to call them anything. He just said Jewish. But then 1810 came, and Reform Judaism started. But we'll get into that later in another presentation. 3 main religious groups today. Orthodox, and I'm talking Jewish, not Eastern Orthodox. If you're in Christianity, Orthodox means Eastern Orthodox. And boy, could I say a lot about that, including the fact that we're dumb as doornails if we don't realize it's a huge part of the Christian world. It's just, in America and in the West, it's a very small part. 100 million Russian Orthodox in Russia, for example. Reform, not reformed. There is Reformed theology. I had that book by, what was that guy that died? R.C. Sproul. Was it Sproul? Yeah, Sproul. What is Reformed doctrine? This is Reformed something. That's Reformed. Calvinists, for instance, Lutherans. It's Reform. My mother said it's because we're always willing to reform. Which, by the way, Reformed says, but they're stuck in, they don't really change. And conservative, which is in between. And we'll see later why these groups came into being. There are others, such as Reconstructionist. That's another one. There were other branches that it's formed more like 20th century. And even some people would say Messianic Judaism. That's debatable. Okay, who is it? Those who keep kosher law. Okay? May be considered really Jewish. My neighborhood, I grew up in a town that was probably 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 Protestant, 1/3 Catholic. Now, in Massachusetts, you get a lot of that. Then again, my 5th grade picture, someone posted recently on Facebook, 5th grade picture. And I think it was my class, it might have been another one, because we had a few classes in the same school. Look, maybe 2 people are not Jewish in that whole class. They used to have to close down during Yom Kippur because there weren't enough kids to have class. That's what it was like. But there was Jewish-Gentile intermarriage. I can think of 2 of them that I know, okay, because my mother mentioned it. If you're Jewish, your mother is responsible for your instruction. She's not if you're Orthodox, but if you're Reform, conservative, yeah, the mother knows everything. There is a grapevine. You would not believe the Jewish grapevine. It's probably exists in other cultures too. You know, if you're Greek, whatever, you know, the mother's talking, you find out. But girl next door to me, there was a family, you know, with 3 girls, and it turns out one of the parents was not Jewish. My friend and I can't call it a gang like gang warfare. I mean, just the kids we hung around with, because there were so many of us back in the baby boomers. One of my friends, I found out from my mother, he was Jewish. I found out from my mother he had a Gentile parent. So maybe it's just someone who says I'm Jewish, even though they're maybe half Jewish. Okay, Romans 2:28-29. For he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly. Neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart and the spirit, and not in the letter. His praise is not of men, but of God. Now you look at that, aha, we Christians are the true Jews. But you got to watch it, because what does Paul say right after that? The next passage is Romans 3:1 and on, and then he gets into the physical Jews. Paul in Romans, he's talking about spiritual Jews, and he's talking about physical Jews. And you got to look at the context to see which one he's talking about. Galatians 2:14, Paul calls Peter a Jew. I was having this argument, that's what Facebook's for. Actually, I was having an argument with someone on Facebook. He says, never is a Hebrew Christian, whatever, called a Jew. Well, excuse me, Galatians 2:14, Paul calls Peter a Jew, contradicting the belief that Hebrew Christians are never called Jews in the Bible. Usually they're not, but at least one-on-one like this. Now, Luther believed in perspicuity. In other words, the Bible should be easy to understand. You got to realize he was reacting against the Roman Catholic teaching magisterium. Okay? Jesus talked in parables to hide truth. I have taught a little on the parables. They have been ignored since the Reformation. Because Reformed doctrine is, which is very Calvinistic, says God, you're going to heaven, you're going to hell, and that's that. Okay, at least so Calvin said. Luther just said you're going to heaven.
Predestination. Right?
Yeah, it's predestination, but they don't understand what predestination really is. Here's the problem. For that reason, the parables are about people making their choices and God's not making them for them. So they've been kind of short-shrifted in the last half millennium. This is according to one source, and I can believe it, because when you listen to people talk about parables, there's very little depth. And I'm trying to get the parables together and teach them in depth, where I actually teach adult Sunday school in my own church, where I'm an associate pastor. Now I'm not paid. I just teach a class a week. I can give communion. But anyway, the parables are so deep, and we are so shallow in our understanding. Forget perspicuity. Well, that's the first reaction to the Catholic teaching, again, of a teaching magisterium. It's what the magisterium says. And if you don't think that evangelicals don't believe some of that, then you haven't been to a church which says the pastor's always right because he stands behind the pulpit and his anointing takes over and there are angels and blah, blah, blah. Okay? They exist. I've been there. So it's not the Pope, it's somebody else. By the way, Catholics don't even believe the Pope's always right. Only when he speaks ex cathedra is he infallible, according to Catholic doctrine. You know when the last time he did that was? Anyone know? 1950. Were any of us even alive then? And what he said was absolutely false about the Ascension of Mary or something. But anyway, Peter said that Paul's writings were hard to understand. Yeah, and they're still hard for us today. Whoops. Who is a Jew? John 18:36. Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered to the Jews. Well, Jesus was Jewish. But now is my kingdom not from hence. John 19:38. Joseph of Arimathea being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews. What's a Jew there?
And it's capital J, and it's the leadership. It's the Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
Is who that refers to.
The religious leaders. Some people will say just people from Judea. But it's really the religious leadership. You got to understand that, because John especially, which was the last gospel written, it comes across as anti-Semitic if you're not careful. John 20:19, the doors were shut, for the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews. Acts 12:11, and when Peter was come to himself, he said, now I know of a surety that the Lord hath sent his angel, and hath delivered me out of the hand of Herod, and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews. See, Jews there is really the religious leadership that was against Jesus and against the Christians. By the way, there were the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, which aren't mentioned in the Bible, and the Zealots. And most people didn't belong to any of those groups. It wasn't like Republicans and Democrats. I mean, you know, it was,
Well, there were also the wouldn't sees and couldn't sees,
yeah.
part of that group.
So what does the term the Jews mean in these 4 verses? Obviously the Jewish religious leaders.
Yeah.
Think of today's oath takers or other Americans that love our country but fear the feds. They'll say, yeah, I'm an American, but it's the government I fear. Okay, maybe some of you are, that's not the issue. But Jews were the first persecutors of the church while the civil government protected them. The Romans, you look in Acts, the Romans were protecting the Christians originally. Really throughout the book of Acts. Later, after what was in the book of Acts, the Jews lost their political power. They lost Jerusalem in 70 AD. And the Romans persecuted the church. Some of these emperors started getting more diluted in their deification, and that probably started in the 60s. So there's a bit of an overlap. But basically, and this is going to come to in the very last presentation, I'm going to show you how important this is. Someone from the tribe or kingdom of Judah, for instance, in 2 Kings 16:6. Maybe that's a Jew. Someone from Judea in the New Testament versus foreign Hellenistic Jews. Okay, there was a huge cultural divide, even in the early church. The first problem that the church had is found in the book of Acts, and it's not persecution, and it's not, well, it is persecution. But after that, the first divide within the church, what was looking to be a divide, wasn't a theological issue, it was a cultural issue. You had Hellenistic Jews, Greek-speaking, Greek names, and you had Jews really from what they call Palestinian Jews, probably Aramaic-speaking, maybe Hebrew names. And the first problem when they had to have 7 deacons, who by the way all had Greek names, was because the widows were saying, hey, you know, they're getting more than we're getting. It was a cultural thing, very important in the New Testament. What is Israel? The land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, the people of Israel, the Jews. You know, name given to Jacob after the wrestling with the angel of the Lord, that's when it first came.
Israel.
Yeah. 12 tribes that left Egypt and settled Canaan. The northern kingdom of Israel, once you get on in the Bible, it's Israel and Judah after the split, which was after Solomon died. And his son Rehoboam, stupidly, tried to continue Solomon's overtaxation, and the kingdom split. But actually that split, that was even there in the days of David, if you look. David ruled over Judah for 7.5 years, over the whole country for 33 years. That's mentioned a couple of times in the Bible. That was 2 generations before the split. And there was, you know, the split was starting long before that. The state of Israel, Medinat Yisrael, Medinat is state. They don't call, well, they'll call themselves a country too, Eretz, but usually, officially, there's a state of Israel. Well, Judaism of the Old Testament, you read the Old Testament. By the way, I got this book at home, I photographed it. There's King James English here and Hebrew there. Okay? Jews in the New Testament days, again, there's no long 10 lost tribes. These are verses where you had dynamic populations where people moved from one place to another. The New Testament, Luke 2:36, that's Anna. James 1:1, to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. People say, well, that has to do with Christians and New Israel. The Bible never says New Israel. That's an Augustinian teaching. No, there were 12 tribes scattered abroad. There were not 2 tribes, there were 12. In Revelation 7, you know, 144,000 Jews, and it seems like there were 12,000 from each tribe of Judah until you really, every time you see a list of 12 names, read it carefully. 12 tribes. You want to know why? Number one, there were 13 tribes. Very explicit. Okay, there was Levi plus 12 tribes, because Jacob had 12 sons, but Joseph, remember Genesis 48, Jacob legally adopts Joseph's sons, Menashe and Ephraim, and they become heads of tribes, so we really get 13. Okay? But if you read that list, it puts Joseph in for one of his kids, and it also puts the other kid in. So that would be 13, except Dan is missing. Every time you see a list of tribes, read it carefully, maybe write it on a piece of paper, what tribe's missing. You go in when they were donating stuff, there in the wilderness, you had people, let's see, you get into numbers, there's Leviticus numbers, you had people donating, 12 tribes donating to the tribe of Levi. So there's really 13 tribes. 3 groups in the New Testament: Jews, proselytes. Proselyte, if he was a man, got circumcised, he had all the legal rights of a Jew, at least for religious law. God-fearers, they would go to services, the synagogue, they were Gentiles, they were not allowed past the court of the Gentiles in the temple. They liked, and with all this paganism around, they liked the Jewish ethics, morals, but they did not get circumcised. They were not really considered Jews. Ethnically, there were Grecians and Hebrews. Again, Acts 6:1, when that problem arises. In the New Testament, you had Hellenistic Jews. In fact, we'll get into a bit of the intertestamental period. And if you don't understand that, much of the New Testament, not the major doctrines, but what's going on, goes right over your head. Because there were wars. John Hyrcanus went into Samaria, and, there's a lot that happened in the intertestamental period. Protestants tend to ignore that because there was no scripture written, or at least ever since Luther took Maccabees, 1 and 2 Maccabees out of the Bible, which probably didn't belong there. The Jews, we have no evidence that the Jews ever considered that canonical. But then again, in the days of the New Testament, what was canon? I don't even think they were asking those questions. It's interesting. But basically, you had Grecians and, you had the Hellenistic, the whole thing with the Sadducees and everything, whom they were selling out to, that whole thing started before the Romans even took control. Hellenism fractured Judaism into different parties. And that was Alexander the Great brought that in the 4th century BC. So a lot of these, Sadducees versus Pharisees, some of it just had to do with how do you deal with the Romans and how do you deal with that Greek, with what happened years ago with the Greeks.
Well, during the Maccabean revolt in Hanukkah, there was the religious sect that was fighting also, and that later became the Sanhedrin.
Yeah, there's, it gets complicated, just like today's politics gets complicated. But anyway, ethnically, you had, and then the Hebrews, really people who would have had Hebrew names spoke. Now here's the debate: what did the children of Israel? What did the Jews speak in the New Testament times? Some say Hebrew, some say Greek, some say Aramaic. I'll put in a fourth one. Have you ever heard of Yiddish? Judeo-German or Ladino, Judeo-Spanish. Jews take Hebrew wherever they go and mix in languages. Historically, that's what's happened. So Yiddish is written with the Hebrew alphabet, but it's probably more German than anything else. There's got a lot of Hebrew in there, and it's got a Slavic syntax. It's got some Russian and Polish words, and when they come to America, they put in English words. Williamsburg, New York, the native language for maybe 300,000 Jews is Yiddish. And there's actually a Yiddish-speaking, there's another place where they brought up speaking Yiddish, and it's in Russia, near the Russian-Chinese border. There's one city. Now, the Soviet Union haven't broken up. I'm not sure exactly if you could even say Russia anymore, but there's a city there, and it probably happens in places like Mea Shearim. Actually, Mea Shearim in Jerusalem, I think they're native Hebrew speakers. But the thing is, my guess is what the Jews spoke might have been a mixture of Aramaic and Hebrew, which are cousin languages anyway. English has no cognate language. You know, you learn German, you can learn Dutch in a few weeks, right? You learn one Latin language, it's not hard to learn another. English is different than anything. You know, you want to do pig Latin, you know, like kids do, but that's just all made up. Judaism of the New Testament, there were four main groups based on belief and practice. Most people belonged to none of them. The Pharisees, there was some engagement with Jesus. Hey, you argue more with people of like belief than you do with people of very different belief. Jesus argued with them. To the extent where some people think Jesus was a Pharisee, but he absolutely was not. They had externalized things. By the way, modern Judaism is based on the Babylonian Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud was written by Pharisees. Because the Sadducees didn't survive the destruction of the temple. They were the temple group. Legalistic as all get up, they ran the synagogues. And if you call a Christian a Pharisee, it's an insult. Not to the Jews. They don't even consider it an insult. That's our religion.
Mhm.
Sadducees, the liberals, one engagement with Jesus, where they took something out of the apocryphal book of Tobit, changed it a little. Now, Tobit, you got this woman that's been married 7 times, and every time she goes to consummate the marriage, a demon kills the husband, so she's been married 7 times and she's still a virgin. What did the Sadducees say? Well, they had levirate marriage. If I die and don't have any descendants, my brother gets to marry my wife and make descendants, but they'll inherit, they'll take my inheritance. Okay, now, they went through that. When she's been married 7 times and no heirs, whose husband is she in the resurrection? Okay, they took something from Tobit. By the way, the fingerprints of the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha are all over the New Testament. You know why we don't know that? Because our Bible notes don't reference them. Greek philosophers, Paul quoted the Greek philosophers time and time again. We don't even know that. Sometimes he'll say it, well, as some of your, one of your philosophers have said, or one of your people have said. But usually it's just, wretched man that I am. I looked that one up. Aristotle had it 7 times in one essay. There's a lot that gets quoted from other sources besides the Old Testament in the New Testament. But we don't know that because we don't have those marginal notes. The Essenes, they're not even in the Bible. In the Zealots. Judaism of the New Testament, there were divergences from the law of Moses. Okay? In other words, God told Moses, this is what you do, but by New Testament times, things had changed. So you got to be careful. Oh, this is the New Testament, this is the Old. Well, maybe they changed something. Passover and communion. Where did Jesus institute communion? During a Passover Seder. If you actually look at the Old Testament in Exodus 12, there were 3 elements. Matzah, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, and the lamb. There was no wine. There was no 4 cups of wine.
Right.
Now it's 5 cups. They got a cup of Elijah. But communion was instituted based on the 4 cups of wine. It probably goes back to FRC. A lot of this stuff you have to try to figure out when they actually started it.
Said the FRC.
Huh?
You said it went back to FRC.
FRC?
What you just said, communion went back to something. I thought you said FRC.
No, 4 cups of wine.
Okay.
FRC?
That's what I thought I heard you say. So I was going to ask what that was.
4 cups of wine.
Okay.
Easter. You see Easter in the book in Acts 12.
Talk about the King James Version.
Yeah, but it's not in there.
They put that in there.
I know.
There.
It says the Greek word is Passover.
Passover.
Oh, here's one of the things though. When you look at that, realize Passover was supposed to be a 1-day holiday, but eventually it became the whole Feast of Unleavened Bread was called Passover, so it's really 7 days. That clears up the confusion. By the way, Seders, when I do a presentation on Passover, people still can't figure out how Jesus Christ could have a Passover meal one night and be crucified on the Passover the next day. That's what happens when you grow up Gentile. No
Because
offense.
Because sundown of the day before. is
Nothing to do with it.
Passover, huh?
The customs had changed. To this day, outside of Israel, you have 2 Seders, so that the whole thing lasts for 8 days. And there were reasons for that. In Israel, it's 1 day. Who knows what it was back in Israel then? There's probably two Passovers, one after the other. I grew up like that. Passover Seder one night in my house and the next night in my grandparents'. There's a 600-something page book on this. I haven't read it, by an author I respect. I don't need to read it. It's not hard to figure out once you've been in it, you know. And but I think some people have such an ignorance of Jewish custom. See, when the Bible says this, customs went like that. And they weren't always the same. Yeah, when they had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Well, actually, it doesn't say Easter. It says Passover. Which is often a 7-day holiday. I mean, if you really look at it in the law of Moses, it's 1 day, and then you get, that
Feast
kicks
of
off the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Yeah.
But the lamb, Passover has 3 or 4 meanings. The lamb, Exodus 12:11, and thus shall ye eat it with your loins girded and your shoes on your feet and your staff in your hand, and ye shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. It's also the Passover meal. Today we call it a Seder, Hebrew word for order, or Seder. Seder. If you actually go to Israel, they'll say Beseder, and that means in order. In other words, okay. You okay? You know, you just fell or something. Beseder, top of Beseder. But it's order. The first day it's a holiday. And the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread is now, okay, here's the reason. First of all, growing up with it, Ezekiel 45:21, in the first month and the 14th day of the month, ye shall have the Passover, a feast of 7 days. Unleavened bread shall be eaten. Now, people have debated that. Here's the reason. Hebrew had no punctuation as it was originally written. So, could he mean the Passover and then there's the feast of, kicking off the Feast of Unleavened Bread? So perhaps that does not justify calling the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread the Passover. However, Jews certainly do it today. I'll tell an interesting story at the church in Kenai. I'll tell that in another one. Okay, Luke, now, the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. There you go, Luke 22:1. Then you know that it's 7 days. Passover can last for 7 days, even though it originally wasn't what God prescribed. It's just customs change. Customs, voice of the bridegroom. Okay? You had, remember Jesus, John the Baptist? The friend of the bridegroom. The rabbis call this person the Shoshbim. He was responsible for it all. He was the person selected by the bridegroom to conduct the marriage negotiations on his part, helped arrange the marriage, carried messages between the bridegroom and the bride during the time of the betrothal. He was in charge of the entire marriage event. Remember, a wedding ceremony lasted for 7 days. He invited the guests, planned and organized the wedding ceremony, and hosted and oversaw the reception. He arranged the details of the wedding's week-long festivities. He arranged the honeymoon, going ahead with the couple to make sure everything was in place for his friend and the bride. Secured their new home, preparing it for the couple to live in. He acted as an intermediary between the betrothed couple before and after the wedding. And this one might sound strange to us, stood outside the wedding chamber. In other words, after it was consummated, he knew. To hear the joyful shout of the bridegroom who confirmed the virginity of the bride in the consummation of the marriage. So, in John 3:29, he that hath the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom, which standeth and heareth him, he's the guy outside while you're copulating. And when you're done, he'll announce it. Rejoiceth greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. This my joy, therefore, is fulfilled. By the way, a bunch of people called 3 different things in the Bible, the New Testament. Same group of people, but it's not synonymous. The bride. Jesus is marrying a bride, right? We are the bride of Christ, even if you're a guy. The body. We are the body of Christ. Ephesians is about the body of the head. Colossians is about the head of the body. Church. See, Jesus sees a bride. We see a body, and the world sees a church. What church do you go to? They don't say what body do you go to, what bride. I mean, you know, it's the same group of people. But depending on the perspective, is it the body of Christ, like Paul talks about, that's us? Is it the church? The church, yes, that's a Christian's perspective, but it's also a worldly perspective, or the bride of Christ. Luke 1:39-41, John the Baptist leaped in his mother's womb upon hearing the voice of Jesus. Hearing starts on the 6th month, according to someone who has a master's in speech and hearing sciences, and I happen to marry. This is typological of what we just read in John 3:29. Even as before he was born, he was leaping at the voice of the bridegroom. And then later, in a sense, he did it again. The point, New Testament practices could be different than what we'd expect by simply reading the Old Testament. The Bible says, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Any questions, comments, debates, whatever? Just don't throw stones. Hey, I'm here. I'm not saying I'm right about everything, okay? The Bible's right. So, you know, a lot of these things get complicated. We keep learning more and more. It's amazing what they're pulling up just in excavations. So, any questions, comments? If not, I'll turn this off. Well, I went for over an hour? Wow.
Okay.